Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. The winner of the Booker Prize 2023, Paul Lynch's novel Prophet Song, presents a terrifying and shocking vision of a country sliding into authoritarianism in a deeply human portrait of a mother's fight to hold her family together. On a dark, wet evening in Dublin, scientist and mother of four Eilish Stack answers her front door to find two officers from Ireland's newly formed secret police on her step. They have arrived to interrogate her husband, a trade unionist. Ireland is falling apart, caught in the grip of a government turning towards tyranny. As the life she knows and the ones she loves disappear before her eyes, Eilish must contend with the dystopian logic of her new unraveling country. How far will she go to save her family, and what or who is she willing to leave behind? Paul Lynch is the author of the novels Red Sky in Morning, The Black Snow, Beyond the Sea, and Grace, which won the 2018 Kerry Group Irish Novel of the Year. Again, the new novel is Prophet Song, and it's a great honor to welcome Paul Lynch to this week's book show. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, Joe. It's great to be here.
Congratulations on the Booker. What a wonderful honor and greatly deserved.
Thank you. You know, it's strange when you sit down to write a book, you're not thinking about winning prizes. You're just thinking about, well, can I write this damn thing, And nobody asks you to write it. And you're making an enormous investment every time, maybe three. This one took close to 4 years. And there was so much going on during the writing of the book. There was COVID. There was lockdowns. There was, an infant was born. There was periods of ill health, and still, this book it just had to be written. So now to find at the end of all of this that I've won the Booker Prize is it's an honor. It's a lovely thing, and I'm still not sure it's fully happened. If I'm really honest, it sort of belongs to the counterfactual of my novel.
It takes a while to seep in. Did you ever question yourself on the premise in the sense of what you wanted to say within the pages of the novel, of to have the country slide into this authoritarianism in the way that it did?
It's an interesting question, because when you sit down to write, or at least when I sit down to write, I don't fully know yet what I'm going to do. When I started writing this book, I had spent 6 months writing the wrong book, 6 months trying to chisel through hard granite. And there was a Friday afternoon and I just stopped. It was about 3 o'clock and I said, okay, I'm done now. This book is done. This is not a book. It's not meant to be a book, and I'm going to leave it be. But I had a feeling that there was another novel there. And so I came back on Monday morning, opened a document and waited. And then I wrote the first page of Prophet Song, very close to how it is now. And as the sort of weeks progressed, I realized that I was writing into a version of Ireland that doesn't exist, but it's still a familiar version of Ireland, that it's a version of Ireland that may be counterfactual or may be set in the near future. It may also be a version of Ireland that some people might read as dystopian, though I would personally have a problem with that. But the Ireland that I was writing about, it gripped me, and I realized that what I was writing about was really a story of what's actually going on around the world, but through the prism of my own life.
This novel seemed so close to what so many parts of the world. I mean, one of the things that the Booker Prize does is makes the book known across the world, and of course in here in the United States and elsewhere. This is not, whether it be Ireland or what's happening in New York or what's happening in other parts of the world, England, Germany, wherever, that there is this feeling. So that's almost a universal feeling, it seems to me.
There was some lines from Cormac McCarthy's The Crossing that I notebooked many years ago, and they came to mind when I was writing this book. They go like this, something like this: the task of the narrator appears to be an easy one. He seems to be required to choose his tale from the many that are available, but that in fact is not the case. The case is rather to make many of the one. And that's what I realized was happening with this book, that as I was writing it, I was allowing space within the story for a sense of the mythic to enter, a sense of the mythic past, almost the mythic future too, this sense of just almost eternal recurrence. And when you create that space in the book, a universality starts to enter into the tale. And I realized that the book was starting to speak to multiple political realities from around the world. It was speaking to all these crises that we, societal collapses and wars that we see around the world on our TV. And I realized this was really important to me because I know as a citizen that when I watch the news, I'm not truly impacted by what I see. And we have been bombarded by the spectacle for decades. And I'm 46 now, and I put on the news and I'm watching it, and I'm just not, it's not getting past my self-defenses. And I'm not a political writer. I'm not seeking to plant ideas in people's heads, but I'm asking questions. And one of the things that fiction can do is it can bypass those self-defenses. And that's the place where empathy becomes possible.
Given what you just said and that universality, was that the reason for the often the lack of a specificity of the type of authoritarianism, of what they actually wanted to do, and the really the mission of the operation they were undertaking?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's many reasons why I kept that to the background. It would have destroyed the book completely had I pulled that into the foreground. For starters, if you identify the nature of the political threat, then the book becomes about that political threat and what the book is actually about now. For me, the idea was that if you take the Iliad, for example, where it foregrounds the politics, it foregrounds the heroics of war, and the great epic characters, and you turn that book inside out and you shake it. What are you left with? You're going to get the people who are in the background dealing with the losses, dealing with the reality of life lived in that world, and that's what I'm chasing after here. It's to foreground the ordinary lives, to foreground is sort of the hidden cost of these kind of events, because the politics is always variations of one thing or another thing, but the outcome remains the same. And I'm interested in the outcome. I'm interested in, how do I put this? I'm interested in problems of grief. I'm interested in loss. I'm interested in the unrecoverable. I'm interested in the ordeal and what people have to go through. I'm interested in the denial of Eilish Stack as she moves through this book, that she keeps telling herself that the world that she knows is going to remain, that things will get better. The denial that the Medusa that you should not stare at, that's going to manifest itself. That she's constantly telling herself this cannot be allowed to happen here. And I think this is a really interesting psychology, because I think many people around the world are living in countries where they're telling themselves, but this won't be allowed to happen here. I think you're probably dealing with some of this in America right now, and it's an ancient problem. When it does happen, how do you even decide to leave? That's another thing the book explores. How do you get out? How do you know when it's time to get out? And as we learn in the book, getting out is the most difficult thing to do in the world. Leaving the world that you've known, leaving your place that you've lived in, leaving your job, leaving, all these things that make you you, all these identities. Leaving them behind is just the hardest thing to do. And it cannot be done until all these things are unplugged one by one. And this is some of the things that interest me as a writer.
Paul Lynch is our guest on this week's book show. The new novel is Prophet Song, which won the Booker Prize for 2023. As you talk about Eilish saying, I this can't happen in this country, I mean, it's almost very much a reaction from that of as a just a common sense reaction from a mother of, well, you can't do that. That doesn't make sense. I am in charge of these children. I am doing this. There's great logic in her opinion as to why this can't happen.
Yeah, I mean, if you've spent all your adult life, all your life living in a liberal democracy, then those are that's the rules of the world that you live in. That's the environment that you know, and anything else is inconceivable. For example, when Larry, her husband, is taken in, questioned by the GNSB, who are Ireland's newly formed secret police, the Garda National Services Bureau, they put it to him that his actions as a trade unionist are seditious, and ask him to prove to them that he's not agitating against the state. And as a trade unionist, he can't process this. He's like, he thinks, I'm living in a liberal democracy. I'm a trade unionist. This is what I'm allowed to do. And the same logic applies to Eilish as she tries to keep her family together. But at the same time, there's another logic at work in the book, which is the implacable logic of what's unfolding around, which is the unraveling of our democracy, the unraveling into civil war and the abyss. And this implacable logic is always just out of sight in the book. It's just there at the edges, and Eilish is responding to it. And I think that when something can be felt but not quite seen, I think it increases our terror. And Eilish is constantly trying to outwit this. And I think of Greek heroines. I think of, characters who are constantly trying to outwit these enormous, implacable forces that seem to be set and designed by the fates. And meanwhile, the character like Eilish is determined to outwit it, determined to um at some form of agency and ability to get past these enormous problems, but yet you can't. But because this thing is it's just too great.
There is the government, of course, and the agents and what is happening on the ground. But then there's also the neighbors and the people who live within the community and who are supporting this or supporting what's happening with the government. You don't explore even their relationship as much other than, okay, well, this is what they believe in. So Eilish is now going to go somewhere else because this is how they believe.
This is what gives the book its universality. It's allowing these spaces to open up within the novel so that readers from other situations, other countries, can see themselves in this narrative. And this has been interesting for me because I've been, I was in London around the Booker Prize, and there was an evening where a Ukrainian refugee came up to me and she said, "You have told her story," and I was quite astonished by this. And the next night, a Palestinian lady came up to me and she said the same thing. And it seems extraordinary to me that as a writer in Dublin, I live in a very quiet suburb, a very peaceful place, sitting in my garret, so to speak, writing this book, that somehow I could craft this story that's able to speak to all these different problems around the world. And that's how this book works. It seems to be a bit of magic to it, if because that surprises me still.
There is certainly a magic to it in that sense, because I would think it would be incredibly difficult not to want, out of just a curiosity as to what would bring people to the other side, what would bring people to that place of supporting this authoritative government.
Yeah, but I mean, isn't it? It seems to me to be somewhat obvious. I mean, discord and division are the norm. Tribalism is the norm. I'm sitting in Ireland watching American politics, and it just seems to be tribal at this point. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with policy, from what I can see. It's
Right.
just everybody's organizing along tribal lines. These are sort of, this is human nature, unfortunately. And this is, yeah, it seems to me there is no need for the book to articulate these things, because once you articulate them, you're changing what this book does.
Were you ever worried about Eilish giving up, or was that a sense that you always wanted this character to pursue, keep going, and digging in?
It's not a question about a character giving up. It's about what needs to happen in this book. And in this book, there was the last line revealed itself to me, which I won't say what it is, but for those who read it, they'll know what it is. And that last line had to be proved true. And so the book unfolded to me like a QED. A series of equations, a kind of of truths. This because of this, because of this, because of this. And within those truths, Ailish is doing her thing, trying to outwit the forces that are beyond her. And there are things that happen to her, there are things that happen to her family that fit the logic of the narrative. They are, some of these things are very punishing. Ailish is subjected to things that were painful for me to write, without a doubt. And yet, the book, in my opinion, remains entirely truthful. It doesn't deviate off the path of truth. And so, Ailish, right up to the last sentence, her path seems to me to be completely inevitable.
That last line stuck with me. It's gorgeous. It's a beautiful ending to the novel, and I'm just curious as to, as you said, it came to you, but did you then have to write your way into it almost?
Write my way into it. I mean, I had to grapple with what I'd taken on for sure.
Right.
You know, I think that when you're going to take the reader into hell, as Dante does, I think you need a poet like Virgil to come alongside you. And so for me, there needed to be some grace and there needed to be some poetry. There needed to be something to hold the reader's hand so that the reader, when they're asked to look into the abyss, doesn't fall in. That's really important. So those are some of the considerations. There was a moment in the book, I'll describe it as the eighth circle of hell, where I couldn't write it. It was too much for me, and I thought that is going to be too much for the reader, and I had to consider very carefully what it is I was going to do, how I was going to do it. I didn't even quite know how to do it. There was a standoff for about 3 months. It was during a lockdown here as well, making life more difficult to write it. But I had a dream that showed me how to write the chapter, and I realized that what I had to write was truthful, that it was necessary within the logic of the unfolding of the events. And so I understood from the dream how to write that chapter. And I got in the car and I broke the curfew, which was amusing because I felt like I was living in a version of my own book very briefly. So I would have to justify myself to the Irish Gardaí, the police here, if I was stopped. But it was fine. I just went to a house in the country so I could write, and I wrote that chapter very quickly. It had been writing itself quietly, I think, in my mind.
Had that happened to you before, where you had things that had been writing themselves?
Oh yeah. I mean, the beauty of being an artist is that you get to get up close to this subconscious, this aspect of mind that produces the art that you're channeling from. And it's quite something, because it operates from the blind of our mind. You don't see it, but it's there, and you nurture it, and you give it time, and you give it silence, and you give it space, and it will come up with the goods. And when I was writing my first novel, or my third novel, Grace, I remember working on the novel for a few weeks without understanding what it would be. And then I realized that I had spent 6 months researching famines. I've been researching Mao's famine in China. I've been researching other famines. And I suddenly knew an awful lot about how famines worked, and the psychology of it, and the economic and the social impacts. And I realized that I'd been researching for a book all along that I had no idea I was going to write. So there's some aspect of mind that's always there, is working away quietly, and then you learn what it is you're about. And so I often wonder how much are we really in charge of ourselves? Very little, I suspect.
Paul Lynch is our guest. The name of the novel is Prophet Song, and it is published by Atlantic Monthly Press. Given what you just said, and Ireland's history, and I don't know, maybe even your history, how the Troubles come into this story, whether they are specific or not.
No, it doesn't bear on it, though I would be lying if I said that it didn't leak in some way from my own memory, because I grew up in Donegal, which is very close to the border. I remember what it's like to go into Derry, for example,
Hmm.
when you would see soldiers everywhere going through checkpoints, the car being stopped, the boot being opened, the trunk as you call it. My father being questioned, walking through streets and seeing army vehicles go by with soldiers leaning at the top with weapons pointed. And I remember that. So that's definitely something I would have leaned into. But, the interesting thing about Irish fiction now is I think something is happening, that it's changing, that we're no longer relying on what may have been the domestic. And that I think this is related to where we are now as a country, and that we are very European. We are very cosmopolitan. We're also very international. We are at that sort of nexus point between the United States and the UK. There's so many tech companies are now, so many Silicon Valley companies are in Dublin. So we're a very, very different country now, very different from a lot of how people like to imagine us. It's how we maybe were 20 years ago. It's a completely different place. And our identities have changed. We've become we just become global citizens. And I think Irish fiction is changing now. It's starting to accommodate that. It's no longer interested, in the mug of tea on the deal table in the kitchen with the clock ticking. And the silences and the oppression. That Ireland is dead and gone, and Irish fiction is moving far, far beyond it.
And I assume you believe, especially since you are a great part of it, that that is a good thing.
I think it's necessary for fiction to evolve. I think every generation has something new to say. Every generation will meet the moment in their own way, with their own forms, their own language, their own unique way of looking at the world, even though most of what we're really getting at has already been written. Like when I read Sophocles, I'm just seeing a master who's already done, but he's got to the point thousands of years before me, and yet we still have to get after these things. We still have to chase them down. We still have to make sense of them for ourselves within the context of the complexity of the world that we live in now. And the world we live in is enormously complex. So I think fiction has to meet this in whatever way it can.
Do you think there was an event that caused the change? I'm just, and the reason I asked the question is because I just finished reading Paul Murray's The Bee Sting, and that book taking place during the economic downturn 2008 2009 of really of changing an entire mindset.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that really the the true shift has occurred somewhere between my generation taking charge in government, because we do actually have young people in charge here. The Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, is around my age. At the same time, allied to that, the revelations of abuse that were covered up by the Catholic Church in all sorts of extraordinary
Mm.
ways, and the institutional abuse that went on for years, the Magdalen laundries and places like that. I mean, what we've done is we have sort of the nation has awakened itself from a very bad dream, that really, when you look at it objectively now, and I look at this as somebody who was a kid in this world and a teenager in this world, that we were living in a theocracy, whether we would admit it to ourselves or not. And we've come out of that, and so we are finding ourselves now as sort of re-identifying ourselves, and it's very interesting to be a part of that, and very interesting to also watch it as a writer, because writers are never truly in the midst of it. We are always skulking in the shadows. We watch, and we sort of one foot in society, but one foot is always outside as well. So we're not truly when we're on the page, we're not citizens.
But you're also not be looking sort of two steps back and looking forward. And I mean, in this book, you're in the future and you're almost looking back.
I would say that I'm not sure if I'm in the future. I mean, it could be in the future, but it could be in the counterfactual present. I mean, one of the things about the term dystopian that I find, I mean, it's useful to label a book. And I met somebody the other day, and he runs a bookshop in Dublin, and he said, "Oh, your book is it's sci-fi, it's dystopian." And I said,
Mm.
"Well, actually, it's not, and here's why. If something in the book is happening in the world, elsewhere in the world right now, it cannot be speculative. It's just that simple. But also the conversation in this book, the sort of the mythic conversation in this book that is conversing about the present and the past and the future. The past, present, and future are always present together in this book in conversation. And so a dystopian novel is just not going to allow that to happen. So I find I find that a very narrow label. But I see what, books have to be called, they need labels, and I'm fine with that. And one of the things that I wanted to do to make that even more realistic was to actually deepen the feeling of reality in the book. It doesn't have any sense of strange reality to it or an imagined reality. This is the language in the book. The reality that Ailish is in is a Dublin that I would recognize now. So these sometimes they're very long sentences, and what they're doing is they're pulling you deeply into the now, into the feeling of being alive in this moment. And it's a moment that's recognizable. And that allows the reader to see the present in this story. And readers in America and readers elsewhere can see versions of the world going on that may also come to be their own world. We don't know. But that's what this book is talking about. It's the questions it's asking are about our responses to these timeless reoccurrences throughout history.
It's such an amazing, urgent, and important novel, and I thank you so much for sharing with us and telling us about it. It was a great pleasure to speak to you, and I can't tell you how much I enjoyed the novel.
Thank you, Joe. It was really lovely to talk to you.
Again, Paul Lynch's new novel is Prophet Song. It is published by Atlantic Monthly Press. Thanks to our producer, Sarah LeDuc. Write to us at book@wamc.org. The latest on National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter at wamc.org and on social media at WAMC Radio. Bookmark us for next week, and thanks for listening. For The Book Show, I'm Joe Donahue.